And get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke media briefing on the upcoming election. I'm Gregory Phillips with Duke Communications and I'm moderating this event. Absentee voting in the 2020 election is underway. There are already reports of long lines in Georgia, limited ballot drop-off locations in Texas and rogue collection boxes in California, all of which raise questions about voting access in America. We have two Duke scholars with us today to discuss why these battles over voting rights matter, as well as how changing demographics in North Carolina and across the South could influence the election here in the crucial swing state of North Carolina and beyond. I'll introduce our speakers and get the discussion started, then we'll open it up to questions. During this discussion, those of you joining us on Zoom can submit questions via the Q&A window at any time. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions in person in a few minutes. Thanks also to everyone watching this on YouTube. With us today is Kerry Haynie. He is an associate professor of political science, as well as African and African American studies, and he directs Duke's Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Gender in the Social Sciences. Good morning.
Good morning.
Also joining us is Robert Corstat. He is Emeritus Professor of Public Policy and History, and he co-authored the new book, Fragile Democracy, The Struggle Over Race and Voting Rights in North Carolina. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And on the media advisory for this event, we listed Professor Mac McCorkle. He was supposed to be joining us, but unfortunately was unable to be here at the last minute. So we're going to press on with who we have. Professor Corstat, so much of what we're seeing right now started in 2013 when the US Supreme Court ruled that states, including North Carolina, no longer needed pre-clearance from the federal government before changing their election law. Can you tell us briefly what the effects of that decision have been in North Carolina?
Right. So in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby versus Holder that Section 4B, which is the formula for which the pre-clearance was determined, was unconstitutional. Didn't rule out the need for pre-clearance, but just said the statistics and the way they were calculating this were out of date, and this should all be thrown out. In North Carolina, the Republican-controlled General Assembly, within a matter of weeks, had an omnibus election law revision that they very easily passed. It overturned reforms that had been in the making for 20 or 30 years, including things like same-day registration, out-of-precinct voting, pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, and also included a voter photo ID requirement. So North Carolina was really ahead of the gun on all of this. Unfortunately, that law, House Bill 589, was challenged in the courts, and ultimately the Fourth Circuit ruled that it was mostly unconstitutional, that it targeted blacks with almost surgical precision in the specifics of it, and that it was unconstitutional. So in North Carolina, I think the Holder has had Shelby versus Holder hasn't had that much impact, partly because the courts have been very aggressive in rolling back the things that the General Assembly tried to do.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Certainly a lot more to dig into there. But Professor Haynie, I'd like to move on to you and this issue of demographics. And how much of an impact could the changing demographics of North Carolina and across the South affect how these states vote this year?
I think quite a bit. Let me start with North Carolina. Between 1984 and 2016, the Democrats only carried this state once. That was Barack Obama in 2008. I think they have a very good chance of carrying in North Carolina this election cycle, in part due to the state's changing demographics, particularly that voters of color are becoming a larger share of the electorate. Back in 2004, blacks were about 1/10 of the electorate. About 20% of the electorate. This time around, people of color will be about 30% of the electorate. So it's been a tremendous increase in the vote share of people of color in North Carolina. Now, this ties into what Bob was talking about earlier, some of the moves that Republicans in this state have done in terms of attempts to suppress the vote. They recognize that this is an advantage, the changing demographics is an advantage for the Democratic Party in this state. And so some of the efforts of voter registration changes, ID requirements, linking in the time for early voting, are in direct response to these changing demographics. And we see this not only in North Carolina, but throughout the South. The demographic shifts that I talked about in North Carolina are similar to what you see in states like Georgia. Florida's demographics have changed. Interestingly enough, the Latino, what we call the Latino community in Florida is changing. It's a diverse community, but a larger share of Puerto Ricans and folks coming from Central America. And so the Cuban proportion of that vote that's typically a Republican vote is becoming a smaller share. And there's some evidence that younger Cuban Americans are less likely to be tied to the Republican Party than their parents and grandparents are. So even those demographic shifts in Florida, and now we see that state is quite competitive. And I think turnout among voters of color will be key. One other thing I'll say about the demographics of North Carolina, we have a large number of colleges and universities in the state, and the student vote has been significant and important the last 2 or 3 election cycles, mobilizing students to get out to vote. Now, in this pandemic crisis, when many of our students are not on campus, I don't know what that means for student turnout. But again, we've seen efforts on the part of the state and Republicans in the state primarily to limit what they perceived to be, and rightly so, an advantage for Democrats in the student vote. There have been efforts to remove from college campuses polling places. And you've had those happen and then be reinstated once you have a change in the boards of elections in the different locations. But again, another effort to suppress the vote in response to demographic shifts that the Republicans perceive to be a disadvantage for their party.
Absolutely. Thank you to both of our panelists for those opening questions. We've got lots to dig into here. Before we move on, I'll let you know that if you're on Zoom, you can type a question in the Q&A window or raise your hand in Zoom so that we can unmute you. If you happen to be joining by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing 9 and we can unmute you so you can ask your question in person. Professor Haynie, I'd like to stay with you. You mentioned the Latinx communities, and we had a question come in from a reporter about this. As it pertains to North Carolina, it says Latinx communities make up nearly 10% of North Carolina's population, but only about 3% of the 7 million registered voters. Can you explain some of the challenges involved in increasing turnout in those communities and why it's important to do that?
Right, and one of the reasons you see the 10% and the 3% numbers is some of the folks are not citizens and not eligible to participate. But one of the things we know about Latino voters is that it requires outreach. Someone needs to go and ask and convince them to vote. If you don't make a mobilization effort, you don't get the turnout. And it tends to be efforts where you actually come into face-to-face contact with someone, or at least can get them on the telephone and have a conversation, often in Spanish. And that will increase the vote. We had some students here, former students, do research on this and found that having contact, and again, the parties have gotten away from that kind of contact by and large. But having contact, someone on the street in the communities, asking folks to come and vote and providing them a reason for voting.
I think Greg, I think one thing that is important for us to remember is that the younger Latinx population tend to be more likely to be citizens and more likely to vote. And I think one of the real challenges for the Democrats is to how to get those young people involved in the political process. I mean, that was one of the ideas behind the pre-registration, where you went into the schools. People got on the voting rolls when they were 16 and 17, and so when they turned 18, they were ready to vote. And that population in the early part of the decade was going to really target large numbers of young Latinx voters whose parents weren't citizens, but they were citizens, and that was going to be a tremendous demographic switch. And I think that's still in the process of happening in North Carolina.
Thank you both. And staying on the topic, of Latinx voters in particular, there tends to be this assumption, certainly at the national level, that those populations will overwhelmingly favor Democrats. and that Republicans need to reach out to minority populations, if they want to maintain any hold on power. That certainly doesn't seem to be happening with the current administration. But do you think that there's a danger in maybe Democrats assuming that minority populations are always going to support them, in a vast majority, or do you think that that's a safe pattern to expect to continue?
Well, I think it's a danger, not only for the Latinx, but also for the Black community. Younger Black folks are not as tied to the Democratic Party as their parents, and the Democratic Party needs to make the case as to why the Democratic Party should be their party of choice. And again, with Latinx voters, they're up for grabs. It's not, on some of the social issues, they're more conservative than mainstream Democrats. But the party has done a remarkable job in pushing those voters away with some of the stances they've taken on immigration and other kinds of issues, have pushed them into the Democratic corners where otherwise they may be attracted to some of the Republican Party ideas.
Yeah, I think the Democrats are going to have to pursue these voters with particular public policies. Whether it's around reductions in the cost of higher education, better schools for their families, raising the minimum wage. I think that you appeal to voters at that level through the particular policies that you're advocating, and to the extent that there's an alignment between what the Democrats are pushing and the concerns and needs that young Latinx voters have, I think that'll really tell the tale.
Gotcha. Thank you both for that. I'd like to move on to some of the things that we're seeing happen right now. There was a bit of a kerfuffle yesterday over the State Board of Elections suggesting that police shouldn't be at the polls, and some back and forth there. I'm wondering, Professor Corstat, if you could talk a little bit about the history of police presence at the polls and how that might be seen as an intimidating factor for some voters. And Professor Haynie, after that, I'd like to hear your take on this too.
Yeah, voter intimidation, particularly at the polling place, has a long history in North Carolina, certainly going back to the period right after the Civil War. Sometimes those elected officials and police were in white robes when they went to the polling place and went to intimidate voters. In later days, in the late 19th century, there were vigilante groups, the red shirts, and I think over time they've still police presence has been off and on. But it's certainly an intimidating factor, and really, I think the Board of Elections was right. Really doesn't have any place in the election process unless there's some kind of real disturbance. There's no need for that, and so I think that's probably a good decision. I was surprised that they actually said even if the law enforcement officers were doing parking duty and controlling parking and traffic into the polling places, they had to be in plain clothes, so as not to intimidate anybody coming into a polling place. So it's we have a long history, so there's a good reason for doing that.
Let me say, I think this is a double-edged sword in this case. I agree with everything Bob said, but in this particular election cycle, when the president has encouraged some supporters, militia types, it appears, to go to and watch the process, having the police there may be a source of comfort for some voters. If you in fact have folks coming in different places to watch and be poll watchers who themselves could be intimidated, it may be having a police presence could be something that favors voters in this case, as opposed to the intimidating. So it's a tricky thing this time around. But I think I agree with Bob 100% on the history of that. And ordinarily, I would say the police at a polling booth, but this time around, I can see an argument for it.
Gotcha. Thank you both for that. Obviously, early voting, early in-person voting in North Carolina begins tomorrow. We saw images from Georgia early this week of incredibly long lines, people waiting hours and hours to vote. Based on what you've seen, can you say how much of that is just unexpected volume at the beginning of polling, or does it come across as voter suppression in terms of that state not supplying enough resources to handle the volume? And do you expect to see the same kind of thing in North Carolina later this week?
No, I'll start, Bob. I think it's clearly suppression. But this time around, right, there's no reason not to have anticipated a large turnout in the middle of a pandemic and folks wanting to get in early and avoid the crowds. They should have been ready, should have had that. This is an intentional effort to discourage voters from exercising their right to vote and not be ready. We've seen this in the last couple of election cycles where we've had unusually and unnecessarily long lines. So I think it's an effort to, again, suppress the vote, again, most often by Republicans trying to overcome advantages in the demographics that they face.
Yeah, I think that, it has largely to do in a lot of these places with the number of early voting sites. So if if you have one or two early voting sites in a community that have thousands of people trying to vote as opposed to multiple ones, you're going to create these kind of long lines. And I think Carrie's exactly right. You could have easily anticipated that. And just whether, elections are in the control of states and to some extent municipalities, and whether they put the resources into it, whether they do the kind of planning that makes voting easy and accessible for people is the issue here. It shouldn't have to stand in line for 10 hours to cast your ballot. That's ridiculous.
Gotcha. Thank you both very much for that. There's also this issue of absentee ballots. And before we get into some of the specifics of that, one of the things I'm curious about, we saw two Republican members of the State Board of Elections here in North Carolina resign over some of the loosening of restrictions around absentee ballots. How much of that is the kind of politicking that you would expect to see around an election, or how huge is it that two members of a State Board of Elections would actually just resign over something that they felt was, politically shady? Is that something we've seen a lot of in the history of this state, Professor Corstat?
Well, I'm not sure that they thought it was politically shady. They were told by Phil Berger, after they voted to support it, according to the news reports, at least, the Berger and the Republican leadership went crazy and basically told these guys they needed to resign and to make a big issue of this. So I don't know what they thought, and it was political grandstanding at its best, I think.
Professor Haynie, what was your take on that move? Yeah, I agree with Bob. I think it was a political stunt, and again, continuing the efforts that the Republican Party in this state has been making over the last decade or so to restrict and voting rights in the state. It's interesting that the National Party, after Obama won, undertook allegedly an autopsy to try to figure out how to attract some of these voters that they're now trying to suppress. And I wish they had taken their own advice and made efforts to try to attract more voters as opposed to trying to suppress the other side.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And then as now we're talking about absentee ballots, I think one of the things that seem to have come into focus is that there's been a lot of speculation on the Republican side and from the president that having a larger volume of mail-in absentee ballots opens up the process to fraud. But then it seems like in previous elections, we've had millions and millions of people voting absentee. What is your take on that? Do you think that there is the potential for fraud when there are more mail-in absentee ballots, or do you think the system is set up to handle it? We should let that run its course.
Let me start. I think always the potential for fraud, but there's no evidence of this type of fraud, or very little. And in fact, I think this is I get very upset when I see media reports of this issue because it's a non-issue. There is no fraud, and the coverage as though it's happening because someone said it doesn't make it so. And I think it's sort of disingenuous. I say to my students all the time, I don't know why we're discussing this. I mean, in lack of evidence, as a social scientist, if the evidence is not there, it's nothing to discuss. So again, another effort to muddy the waters, to make it less likely that people would come out and vote and to trust the system. And there's no evidence. We've been doing this forever in this country in one form or another. And very little evidence that there's significant fraud, and in some of the evidence of fraud, often there are mistakes made or unintended errors, but very little evidence of fraud. And again, when I see these reports, in-depth reports of the potential for fraud, I sort of cringe. Why waste the ink and the airtime?
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out at this point that the North Carolina Board of Elections produced a report in 2013 that revealed that out of 40 million votes cast between 2000 and 2012, there were 2 cases of in-person voter fraud that were referred to the district attorney. However, it certainly has been a huge talking point for people that seem to be moving it for their own ends. Okay, moving on. We've had another question come in. Professor Haynie, you mentioned about maybe some police presence made sense given the president's suggestion that people, militia should go and be present at the polls. Are you concerned that all of that talk about potential armed people at the polls could actually depress turnout to the extent that it could affect the result?
Not really. I think what it will do, what it has done, I think these long lines you see in Georgia and other places, Texas and other places, people are angry. And one of the responses is, I'll show you. So I think you get in that response to the talk of having folks watching and threatening. But if it turns out on election day, you actually have folks there, that concerns me, that someone may show up and see armed folks in the places where you can legally carry publicly a weapon there. That concerns me, that folks may then turn away if they don't see some type of security there, or at least have on call to know that the police can be called if there's a situation at a particular site.
Well, I think one of the things we're seeing with this early voting is safety in numbers. So when you have hundreds and hundreds of people lined up on the sidewalk, that's your self-defense. I mean, I think people can feel relatively safe, that there's some place where they can go and stand in line to vote. So I think it's a funny system that's working its way out here.
Thank you both. Staying in North Carolina, we know that certainly in the early part of the last decade, North Carolina was one of the most gerrymandered states in the nation. Professor Corstat, you mentioned how the Republican bill was kind of criticized for targeting with surgical precision Black voters and packing them into less districts. Of course, the party that controls the state house and the Senate moving forward after this election will have the power to draw the maps based on the census that's going on right now. How, given that the current districts are already the matter of court proceedings, how important is it to the future of the state, at least the next decade, who gets to draw the maps, and how much court scrutiny do you think that the next set of maps are likely to get?
Well, I think it's really important who controls the General Assembly and draws the new maps. Certainly, we've made some progress in the court decisions that have forced the General Assembly to go back and be less partisan in the way the maps were drawn. But still, there's a lot of work to do. The representation among Republicans in the General Assembly and in Congress is way out of line with the numbers that they get for votes. And we also have the skills and the technology now to really do some fair redistricting, and so that the voting process and the representation is more equitable. So I think this is a real opportunity to maybe put the partisanship of redistricting aside. And really get on with the process of creating a more democratic society.
Thank you, Professor Corstat. Yeah, it seems to be worth noting that at least in the 20 plus years I've been in North Carolina, the party that isn't in power is always the one in favor of a non-partisan redistricting commission. But if everybody could agree on that, then perhaps we could move forward. Professor Haynie.
Yeah, let me add a point to this last one. I mean, it's interesting to me that the political parties are paying little attention to the fact that in many states it's the legislature that will draw districts. And it seems to me that there's some efforts to be made to draw voters' attention to this fact and mobilize voters around this issue. That who gets to draw the districts is important. You hear a lot of talk about Supreme Court nominations. I mean, this is equally important to focus on drawing legislative districts, not only for state races, but also for national races.
Sure, and Professor Haynie, you study demographics and changing demographics. Obviously, we've seen how there were some really quite crazy looking districts that were drawn in the last round of maps that got thrown out because of how specifically they were drawn to pack people. As we see the way that demographics are changing across the state, do you think that it could actually become easier to draw districts that are more compact but are still, kind of achieving the party that's drawing them's goal to pack people in one way or another? Or do the demographics, are the way the demographics are changing so spread out that it would still be very difficult, to draw maps that were politically advantageous to one party or another? And I'm sorry.
The parties they'll always find a way to draw districts that advantage their own party. But I think Bob, the point he made earlier is right. With the technological advances that have been made over the decades, it's not that difficult to draw quote unquote fair districts if you do it in a nonpartisan way. We have a colleague in computer science with one of our undergraduates a few years ago, demonstrated a method for doing exactly that. So it can be done, but sure, if you leave it in the hands of the parties, be it the Democrats or the Republicans, they will attempt and succeed at drawing it in addition to their advantage.
Sure, thank you both. We've had a question to come in about how much we should be paying attention to polls in this particular election. The polling, especially in the presidential race, came in for a lot of criticism in 2016, although 𝐓𝐡𝐞 Jon Aldridge said we were misinterpreting the polls rather than that they were way off. Do you think that the polling can give us any kind of guide to what's likely to happen this fall? How much close attention are you guys paying to them?
What I pay attention to mostly, along with I think the polls are fairly accurate in giving a sense of where the race is at the time the poll is taken and some trends. So I look at the trend lines for one, and the other, I look at where the candidates' behavior. So now you see President Trump going to Iowa, was in Florida and Pennsylvania, which suggests to me that they're concerned about the polls that we're seeing, and their own internal polls suggest that they may be in trouble in those places. So I would watch where the candidates go or don't go, along with the polls, to get a sense of where I think the race is.
Professor Corstat, what's your take? What are you paying the most attention to?
Well, I think polls are interesting to watch, and certainly the sophistication of polling is pretty high these days, and so they give you some sense of what's going on. But a lot of it depends on turnout, on last minute changes. I think one thing is there's so many people voting early now. So that I think the polls are going to possibly be more true or truer this year than in the past, because people have voted. They've already, they told the people they were going to vote, here's who they were going to vote for, and they've already done that. So there's not going to be quite as much switching at the last minute. They're not going to be events that will make people decide at the how to change their vote, whether to change their vote or not. So there could be, because of all this early voting, absentee, mail-in voting, et cetera, actually greater stability in the kind of electoral process than we've had in recent years. It's going to be interesting to see.
Sure, thank you. Just a reminder to everybody again that if you have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A window. And if you can raise your hand in Zoom, if you happen to be joining us by phone, you can hit *9 to raise your hand and we can unmute you so you can ask a question. Moving on, we have a couple of questions about the urban-rural divide in North Carolina. And Professor Haynie, since you study demographics, I'm wondering if you think that that urban rural divide is growing as it pertains to voting blocks, or if that's becoming blurrier, especially as the kind of suburbs continue to grow?
I think it's becoming actually clearer, the divide. And there's a definite trend of the rural areas of North Carolina becoming less important because of population changes. So those areas are becoming less populous. And the folks who are there are older, whiter, Republican voters by and large. And the power is moving to the suburban areas of North Carolina, the Charlotte suburbs, the Raleigh-Durham suburbs, the Triad, to some extent, suburban voters are growing. So this divide is becoming clearer, and it seems to be a Democratic Party advantage at the moment, given who's moving to these locations. And in North Carolina, what is attracting the advantage is in part because of in-migration. Folks are coming to Research Triangle Park, this area, because of the types of jobs that are in this area, high-paying, high-tech jobs that attracts a particular kind of person. And even when they happen to be Republican, they're not the old Jesse Helms, North Carolina Republicans who are moving here. They tend to be folks who may be Republicans when it comes to fiscal matters, but on social issues, don't go with the party, the Republican Party, along those lines. And so I think it makes North Carolina an interesting state that really is a state that is up for grabs. And depending on the contours of the particular election, it could advantage the Democrats or the Republicans. And I think this cycle around is an advantage for the Democrats, given the issues that are out in the election.
Yeah, I think Carrie's right about the breakdown of voters in these rural areas, but there are also, there are a lot of low-income voters, white and people of color in rural areas. And one of the things I've been really interested in is looking at the various voting rights groups that are active in North Carolina right now. And there are a couple groups that are focusing solely on rural voters, small town and rural voters, trying to get them registered to vote, trying to get them educated on the issues, and to some extent trying to get them to vote for Democrats. But rural North Carolinians have been hurt probably more than anybody else by the policies of the Trump administration. And it always is striking to me to drive through rural areas and see signs supporting Trump when you know that whether it's on health policy or education policy or health or economic policy, those people are really suffering. They're not the ones that are getting $1 billion buyouts that Trump gave out to large farmers in the Midwest yesterday. So it's good. I think it's going to be interesting to see whether some of this work in the rural areas makes a difference in this election. I think it might.
One of the things, Bob and I both grew up in North Carolina, and we've seen this happen over the course of our lifetimes. One of the things out in the rural areas, I think, though, Bob, that is pushing or keeping some of these white voters who should be Democrats, objectively speaking, again, the presence of racial and ethnic minorities, particularly immigration and groups who are coming from abroad, and some often farm workers, right? And folks see that the places begin to look different and feel different because there are different people moving there. And it has been the source of some concern, and politicians have used that and manipulated the presence of immigrants coming to these rural areas to frighten people or to cast blame on folks where the real issue is something else. So I think that dynamic is important to watch in these rural areas.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, I think that's absolutely true, but again, it's also very misguided because, I think the future of small town and rural North Carolina is with new immigrants,
Yeah.
and whether those come from Latin America or Central America, from Mexico, or where they come from the Middle East or other places. We need repopulation in all these things. And those people who are there running the stores, who have own the banks or, own farmland and stuff. They should be working to get people into those places, trying to create jobs, trying to create some economic activity so we can get some life back in small town North Carolina. So I think you're absolutely right, but I think it's very misguided on their part.
Thank you both for that. And staying in this urban-rural divide, Professor Corstat, I was wondering if you could talk about whether there is a greater risk away from the cities, away from the scrutiny of the large urban areas, of voter suppression happening, in these rural areas that don't get as much scrutiny. Whether it's armed people at the polls or, because there is more of a history of this, right? In the rural areas is where we tend to see more voter suppression and more kind of twisting of the process. How much of a risk do you think there is of that in rural North Carolina and elsewhere in 2020?
Well, I think the voter suppression it's not just applied to rural areas, but it's particularly applied to rural areas that have large African-American populations, particularly in eastern North Carolina. If you want to look back over the last 150 years, there's an awful lot of that. But I think that, the real challenge in a lot of these places is being able to register, to get to register and being able to get to vote. So in these rural areas where they're spread out, a lot of people don't have cars, there's no public transportation. And there's only a couple polling sites in a county that doesn't have that many people. That's a form of voter suppression too. And if we had more mail-in voting, if we had online voting, if we had other ways of allowing people to cast their ballots, other than just showing up at a polling place, then it would be made much easier. But so I think that's the voter suppression is in those areas right now, I think is really about whether people can get to the polls to actually vote, not that somebody's going to be there to push them away when they get there.
Indeed, thank you. We've had another question come in. I'd be interested to get both of your takes on this. And people would like to know how you would characterize the role that North Carolina's significant connections to the military play in voter behavior here. This seems especially interesting in 2020 because, President Trump has reported to have made some very disparaging remarks about veterans and the military, and yet, the military voting bloc, to the extent that it is a bloc, has traditionally been quite conservative. So how do you think that could play out this year, especially in North Carolina with Fort Bragg and Camp Lejeune and some of the biggest military installations here?
Yeah, I think it's something that's worth watching. And my sense is that there's been some slippage in support among military folk for the president and Republican candidates, simply because of the president's behavior and his words. And also, we've had some high-ranking military officers to speak out or express themselves in op-eds, which is unusual. But I think the rank and file sometimes take cues from the leaders when they step out in these unusual ways. Military families are hurting. And there seems to be very little attention given to that. And I think in this context, it may be some slippage in what's usually a strong base of support for the Republican Party. This time around, we may not see that.
Yeah, I've been surprised that there hasn't been more discussion, but among both Republicans and Democrats about those issues, because that Carrie's right. I think that the everyday lives of enlisted men and women in our armed forces is pretty challenging these days, and the public policies and that the Republicans have been following over the last 4 years, I don't think have done very much to improve the quality of life for our service people.
Thank you both. We'll be wrapping up here fairly shortly, but I'll remind everyone you can submit a question via the Q&A window or raise your hand in Zoom, which if you're joining by phone, you can do by pressing *9. So one big question about this election, especially as it pertains to all the absentee ballots, is concerns about the delays in us knowing the result. Based on what you guys know about North Carolina and the history here, and especially because it's considered to be a potential swing state, could be very close in the presidential race. Do you expect that we could see a delay beyond the early hours of the morning in knowing how North Carolina is going to go? How much patience do you think voters are going to need to have in this state?
I'll say for North Carolina, I think it's going to require some patience. We could see this going into the early hours or the following days. But I'll also say that I'm predicting that we'll know the result of the election. We may not have a certified result on election night, but I think we'll have a pretty good system. I'll be safe. If the president loses Florida and Ohio, and these are states, I think both states count their early ballots before the election. If it turns out those states are called on election night, I would bet a lot of money that we would know the result and it won't be in the president's favor if he has lost Florida, Ohio on election night. Even if other states are continuing to count days or even weeks later, I'd stake money that we know the outcome election night.
Professor Corstat, any a take on that?
You gonna take the bet, Bob?
Well, I mean, I kind of agree with Kerry on that. I mean, it hasn't been a problem in the past. I mean, Kerry and I have been voting for a long time in North Carolina, and I can't really ever remember that being an issue. But depending on what kinds of court challenges there are, the shenanigans that various local political leaders are up to, who knows? I mean, I think there are a lot of things on the table in this election that no one in the history of our country would have anticipated. So.
Yeah.
Sure, this is most definitely an unprecedented year, however you look at it. Before we wrap up, there is one last question I'd like to ask both of you. Professor Corstat, you've studied voting rights and voter suppression in this state for a long time. There are so many things flying around in 2020, and even both sides seem to be claiming that the other side is going to try and steal the election. But based on your experience and study, what do you think, if you can isolate one thing, maybe it's more than one thing, are the biggest threats this year to a fair and free election and to people having their votes counted?
Well, well, I think this one of the issues about the problems with absentee ballots and people not getting the right signatures or not, folding the envelope right or something like that. I mean, there looks like some, several thousand African-American voters' votes haven't been counted yet, and maybe they're being sent back. I think I would say that issues like that, things that are up to the discretion of voting officials in certain places may be a big challenge. I mean, I think those are the big issues.
Yeah, what I would say is that, and it's been surprising to me, leave the president aside, that other Republicans have not defended was one of the most fundamental things about democracy, and that's voting in fair elections. To come out and to support the process and defend the process as fair. So that's the biggest threat to me, that Senator Tillis and others in this state and other Republican leaders have not stood up in the face of the president, creating doubt to support the system and voters' right to cast a fair ballot, and that it will be counted, to ensure folks that their ballot will be counted. And that worries me, the fact that they're not defending it actively and proactively defending the process.
Sorry, thank you very much both for that. I think we'll call it there. I think certainly a good note to leave it on is that what we can all hope for is a free and fair election. So we'll leave it there. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, Kerry, Haynie and Bob Corstat, for sharing your perspectives. Next week, briefing returns to the topic of COVID-19 pandemic ahead of the FDA's meeting on October 22nd to discuss the ongoing trials for a vaccine. If you'd like to be on the list for future briefings, please email news@duke.edu to let us know. In the meantime, please stay well and be sure to vote. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Hey, thank y'all.
Yep.